today is Cuba, and I just want the start of my talk has to do with books about Cuba, and specifically those written by the type of people, most of them residing in Florida, who have been for decades looking forward to closing the book on the Cuban Revolution. Capitalists, of course, around the world are haunted by the Cuban Revolution, but you have a particular group in Miami there who are, have, I guess, their own right of return in mind, where they want to return to being the overlords, the casino owners, the landowners, and the villa owners of Cuba once again. And that's certainly a right of return. We don't support their right to return to dominate the island. So just a few of the titles that have been written over the years include in 1971, Maurice Halpern wrote The Rise and Fall of Fidel Castro. So 1971, Fall of Fidel Castro. In 1992, I believe, Andres Oppenheimer wrote Castro's Final Hour. He was in a surge of excitement with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's been a bit of a long hour. And then, of course, I haven't seen a book about it yet, but we all saw last summer when it was announced that Fidel was stepping down and had a serious illness. The folks in Miami, some of them were partying as if they had just won the Super Bowl there. And in fact, when the Super Bowl did happen in Miami in January, there was concern because the anti-Castro exiles and the reactionary community there planned to use the Orange Bowl, same venue as the Super Bowl, I think this year, to have a big death party when Castro died. So this is sort of the level that people are at and the amount of anticipation. And what's disappointing about all this is not just the views of those extreme right-wingers in Miami, but the way the discussion of Cuba and its role in the world always comes back to the mortality of their leader. So I want to talk about Cuba's impact on international events and how that relates to what we do in our anti-imperialist and anti-war activism. First of all, and crucially, Cuba gives us an example of a humanitarian intervention, a number of humanitarian interventions that we can legitimately support. This term, which has become very popular since the 90s especially, humanitarian intervention, versions of it with responsibility to protect doctrine, has become popularized as a way to legitimize wars of aggression, or wars of conquest and plunder, are being done under this guise of helping the people. Whereas Cuba, both militarily and mostly in recent years with genuine humanitarian assistance, have really been making these interventions for decades that we can point to and support in contrast to what the Canadian government has done and obviously to what the United States government and others have done. So I want to shift now to Central Asia and first take a look at the humanitarian intervention of Canada really quickly, just by reference to an article. This one actually appeared in the Vancouver Sun, if you can believe it, in February. And it was a very scathing article talking about the conditions of the main civilian hospital in Kandahar. And it was done by the Senless Council. But actually, they talked to a Vancouver paramedic who wanted to see what's being done in Afghanistan for the people there. So this is the main civilian hospital. The McCormick, his name, Ed McCormick, a paramedic from Vancouver, goes to Kandahar Civilian Hospital and says it's in a state of complete decay, a glaring symbol of the international community's lack of concern for the Afghan people. And then the Senless goes on to describe just unbelievable neglect, not even a semblance of, not even a window dressing of real aid being given to the civilians. McCormick said that none of the Afghan doctors and nurses he interviewed in Kandahar had ever seen a Canadian physician come into their hospital to help or even inquire about their needs. And he goes on to describe the state-of-the-art military hospital that Canadians have set up, a couple of them, to treat their own soldiers when they're wounded. But not a single Canadian physician, military physician or otherwise, had been into the Kandahar hospital. He talks about being able to see his breath. There's no heating. There's no medication. There's no anything. So all of that in Afghanistan, where we're supposedly giving $200 million of Canadian aid, and it leaves you to wonder where that's really going. Now, right next door in Pakistan, in 2005, they had a devastating earthquake that also impacted India. And of course, since it's right next door, you have all these U.S. Black Hawk helicopters, you have all this NATO equipment, you have a couple thousand Canadian soldiers right next door. None of that was mobilized to help the tens of thousands of people killed or displaced by the earthquake in Pakistan. But you did have hundreds of Cuban doctors, believe it or not, who went to the remote areas of Pakistan to give real medical aid. After most of the NGOs have left, as I say, after the militaries of the NATO countries refused to go, refused to divert their precious resources from occupying Afghanistan. So you may not have even heard about this. Even people in this room might not have heard about it. Away from this is an article about it found in the progressive Indian press. Away from the glare of the international media, a team of Cuban doctors has been working among the quake affected. The Cuban government offered its medical expertise to the governments of Pakistan and India immediately after the magnitude of the destruction was known. The Indian government did not even acknowledge the offer, much like the US government when Cuba offered to help with Hurricane Katrina. Pakistan understood the scale of the disaster was humongous and was quick to accept the offer, even though, of course, Pakistan is a military government that has been in alliance with the US in the War on Terror. It goes on to describe the Cubans having conducted more than 2,000 operations, set up 19 field hospitals, and worked 12-hour shifts, working in the cold, not complaining about living just as the people affected by the quake were living. So that's just one example of many of how, in recent years, Cuba's humanitarian aid has contrasted so sharply with the policies of the United States and Canada. I'll stick to just a couple examples, and the next one I want to just look at a little bit is Haiti, sort of the other front of Canada's aggressive foreign policy in recent years. Before the coup in 2004, again, this was something that was not reported on even in much of the left press, so at the time of the coup, I knew nothing about it, for instance. For years, the international community, quote unquote, and the Western powers had been blocking hundreds of millions of dollars of aid in order to financially starve the Aristide government and to make the country of Haiti fail, to become a failed state. And this, of course, is having terrible impact on the people of Haiti and on the ability of this government, which had in mind to provide the basic needs, its ability to do that. So in around the year 2000, 2001, Cuba dispatched hundreds of doctors again to Haiti, at the same time taking in Haitian medical students to train for free in Cuba. Sending these doctors into Haiti specifically to tackle the HIV/AIDS crisis that had just begun to really spread in a severe way in Haiti. And at the time, Fidel Castro spoke to the international community. He made a speech at the UN. It would put it out there. It was even reported in Canada, calling on the Western countries to give a few tens of millions of dollars to give the financial aid needed to buy the drugs, to pay for the equipment. Cuba was offering all of the doctors, and they said, will someone in the international community supply some of the funding? And there was no response. Instead, they continued to block the basic aid and the loans to the government. So Cuba went ahead and did its best anyway. And of course, then in 2004, it wasn't enough just to starve the government. That Canada, France, and the United States decided to overthrow Aristide. And even in that coup and the bloody aftermath, the Cuban doctors remained by their post as much as possible. I think the main hospital in Port-au-Prince got taken over by the U.S. Marines, if I'm not mistaken. Something just absurd. But elsewhere in the country, the Cuban doctors stayed, and to the best of their abilities under occupation, have continued to carry out their medical work in Haiti. So again, just as sharp a contrast as you can get as to what is the meaning of humanitarian intervention. So just to, but I think the more, I guess, relevant in recent years and to some of our discussions is the way that Cuba gives an example, a concrete example of what we can advocate in terms of a genuine foreign policy or a genuine policy of solidarity with people in the underdeveloped world who are fighting for their liberation. You know, oh, you don't support the war in Afghanistan? Well, how are we going to help those people? Well, first of all, stop occupying and looting their countries. Right? Second of all, give reparations for the occupations that you've been carrying out and the wars you've been carrying out. And third of all, genuinely give humanitarian aid, not as a smokescreen for military operations, but genuine transfer of human resources, of technology, and of financial resources for people in those countries to be able to look after their own needs, to determine their own forms of government and development. So one last example, if anyone's had a chance to go to Cuba, you may have been to the Latin American Medical School If you haven't, and you don't read the Cuban press, you probably haven't heard about it. Just outside of Havana, an old military base is now a medical school training, I think at the last count, 8,000 doctors from throughout Latin America and the United States. If you're from a minority community or working class indigenous community in the United States, you can apply and go for 6 years of medical school, pre-med and med, for free in Cuba. I've been to Cuba and talked and met people doing this from the United States, so it's real. And quite a remarkable, I think, contribution. And 8,000 from throughout Latin America. And this was started in the wake of Hurricane Mitch that destroyed much of Central America. It killed tens of thousands of people in Central America in the late 1990s, I think 97, if I'm not mistaken. So Cuban doctors went there and they saw such a glaring lack of basic health care provision in those countries that they decided to start a program of training doctors from those countries for free in Cuba, under the understanding that those doctors would then go back to their own country and provide basic health care in the communities or most of the country where there was none. So often, I think Cuba gets discussed, when it gets discussed on the left, it's either the polemics about the supporting the Cuban government or the nature of the Cuban regime and so forth. And you know, I speak as a supporter of the Cuban Revolution and the government there. I think it's a progressive one, and one of 2 or 3 in the world we can really point to and say that. But that I think there's, and often the discussion of Cuba can become romanticized or demonized, or become talked about as just this historical anachronism. You see this a lot in the mainstream too, that Cuba is a relic of a bygone age of the Cold War, and you know, go to Havana now before it changes, you know, get there and see the quirky leftovers of socialism and so forth. But I think this is a false discussion. I think in actuality in Cuba we see hopefully a lot of the future, and it still has an important role, that revolution, to play in all of the struggles going on around the world. And one of the ways it does that we don't often get to talk about or hear about is with this genuine humanitarian intervention and alternative foreign policy.